Welcome to episode 221 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Byron McClure about 3 ways teachers can take real, meaningful action towards socio-emotional learning practices in their instruction. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript or find our Truth for Teachers podcast community on Facebook. A big thanks to Advancement Courses for sponsoring today's show. You can earn graduate credits or CEUs through over 280 online PD courses in 20 different subject areas for K-12 teachers. Everything is online and self-paced, and you have 6 months to complete the course. Right now, you can save 20% off any course with the code TRUTH. That's less than $120 per graduate credit hour. To learn more, visit advancementcourses.com and be sure to use that coupon code TRUTH for 20% off. Have you ever wondered what career options are possible for former teachers? Daphne Williams of the Teacher Career Coach has lots of resources to help you translate your classroom work experience into skills that are highly sought after in the corporate world. Her course includes resume templates and guidance, contact information for companies that frequently hire teachers, and all the support and community you need to find your next career or just build a side hustle until you're ready to leave the classroom. If you're just curious about options or on the fence, start with the free quiz to identify careers that might be a good fit. Just go to teachercareercoach.com/truth for teachers or click the link in the show notes. You'll find special free resources that Daphne designed for Truth for Teachers listeners. That's teachercareercoach.com/truth for teachers. My guest today is Dr. Byron McClure. He is a national certified school psychologist, and he's currently redesigning a high school in Southeast DC. His work centers around influencing systemic change and ensuring that students from high-poverty communities have access to a quality education. Byron has extensive knowledge and expertise in mental health, socio-emotional learning, and behavior. Byron has done considerable work advocating for fair and equitable discipline practices, and he's designed and implemented school-wide initiatives such as SEL, restorative practices, RTI, and trauma-responsive practices. As a result of this work, led by Byron, his school recently won the 2019-2020 Whole Child Award. So obviously, Byron is doing big things and he is passionate about his work. I think you'll find his energy contagious. He's going to give us a bit of context about what the SEL needs are for students right now, what's trending, and clarify exactly what true socio-emotional learning means, including the history of it and what elements have been intentionally obscured. Byron's also going to share 3 specific practices that you can do with kids to address their socio-emotional needs. We're going to do a deep dive into those, and we're going to spend the majority of the episode on those practical strategies. Then we'll talk at the end about how schools can address teachers' socio-emotional needs as well. Let's get started. So Byron, I know you're well connected to a number of different school leaders and teachers and fellow school psychologists, and I would love to hear about your perception of the larger patterns that you're noticing with students' mental health right now. What kinds of socio-emotional needs are you seeing and hearing about that are really getting you fired up and that are inspiring you to make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question to start out with. And I want to begin, I'm really excited to be here with you. I've been following you for some time, so it's great to connect. But yeah, for this question, in our day and age, look, we got to realize that it's easy to follow trends instead of what's in the actual best interest of students. So everything that I focus on is what's in the best interest of kids. Now, all of a sudden, or so it seems, people have this invested interest in students who live in high poverty communities as well as their mental health. Well, Angela, what gets me fired up is the fact that students with mental health struggles often didn't have adequate support in our schools pre-pandemic. So here's the truth, especially for Black students and other youth of color, many of these students have had unmet mental health needs for decades. Instead of schools being the place to get treatment for their needs, they often have been viewed through a lens of academic or behavior problems, which at times has even led to the criminalization of Black and brown youth at disproportionate rates. At best, I think it's been a little bit disingenuous, and at worst, it continues perpetuating systemic injustices and discrimination, which subsequently led to poor outcomes. Now, the reality is that students and even adults too, and we can talk a lot more about adults a little bit later, but students have historically have experienced, and sadly they continue to have significant mental health needs that are going unmet. That's just the reality. We also have to recognize that many students and their families are also experiencing a number of other things as well, like evictions, displacement, health disparities, increases in gun violence, as well as other violent crimes. And look, students also might be feeling disconnected and disengaged due to isolation and the disruption of their typical routines. Notice that I haven't even mentioned anything academic as of yet. Why?
Mhm.
Because if we're going to address the academic issues that may have occurred during the pandemic, then we also need to fully understand that other kinds of loss our young people have experienced and have plans in place to support them through those losses. I believe that we have a unique opportunity to think and plan differently in this moment. We can focus on building a system that's responsive again to the needs of students. Why? Because that's who we're supposed to be in this business for in the first place. Doing so requires that we begin by listening to those young people and then amplifying what they say they need as opposed to what we as adults think they need.
That's right. And I agree 100% about this being our moment to start reimagining things and to start doing things different because there is so much more awareness now. You're
Yep.
mentioning there's been so many issues going on before the pandemic, and now all of a sudden more people are paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that adds an interesting angle to it because I feel like socio-emotional learning or SEL is a huge buzzword. Lots of districts are now paying more and more lip service, but they're also putting a lot of pressure on teachers to maintain students' academic progress as if this were a normal school year. So I feel like that's leaving a lot of teachers feeling caught in the middle. They want to center kids' socio-emotional needs. They want to pay attention to all of these things that you've outlined here for us. But their admin or their superintendent, maybe even students' parents, are expecting a focus on academic rigor and meeting the standards. What's your take on that and these trends with SEL right now?
Yeah, this is so true, Angela. It seems that everyone is a mental health or SEL expert these days, right? If our educational response to the pandemic is more of the same tired approaches that we were already trying before the pandemic, things like the pages of standards, longer school days, more and more assessment, the truth is it's going to fail, just as it was failing before the pandemic. This work must be more than just a buzzword or the latest trend. It must be action oriented. To me, this means that our work requires steps towards change that actually move the needle, not just lip service. I'll say for me, I've been a school psychologist for years. The past year or so, I've been lucky to redesign, and actually, my job is to reimagine what a high school looks like in Southeast DC. My official title is the Assistant Director of Redesign. Sounds great. But through this redesign process, we've actually been able to envision a school that prioritizes the whole child. And so I'm able to blend my expertise in psychology and mental health and well being to actually bring this inside of the school and see what this looks like. So, my primary responsibility has been designing this concept of the dream team, which is taking SEL to the next level. Through this dream team, we're connecting every ninth grade student with the dream team of caring adults to help them reach their goals. And we do this through a strength based approach, and we begin by helping students identify their top 5 strengths. The primary focus here is shifting from what's wrong to what's strong with students. And we also do this by providing them the support that they need to make their dreams come true. So, in a nutshell, my take on this is that to be in a space where we're authentically going to move the needle, We have to shift from what's wrong to what's strong and actually move to SEL practices that are action oriented.
Okay, let's talk about some of those practical strategies then. I'm going to ask you to share some specific things teachers are doing, but I want to clarify first. Do you think of socio-emotional learning as something that you do with students, or is it more of a lens through which you base your teaching practices and the way the school is run, or is it both?
Right, right. So to me, if you view it through a lens of something that you're doing to students or with students, it's going to fail every time, right? Because the reality is, adults, we think things should be a certain way. Kids and students might think things might need to be a certain way. And if we approach it from we know what's best and our rule is the rule of law, we're going to fail every single time. So for me, I think that it must be integrated and done through a lens that is culturally affirming first. Then, it should also inform your teaching practices by being action oriented. It should address instances of harm and use a strength based approach to building relationships within a sense of community. These practices require a radical shift away from traditional methods that reinforce the structures and systems that have led to inequity in the first place. These culturally affirming SEL practices, to me, they must be rooted in empathy, love, and connectedness at the systems level rather than a focus on compliance and control. Like that's the lens that I use. And my recommendation is to approach this work using that student centered approach, that student centered lens that's based on principles from design thinking. This means you are disrupting imbalances of power. You're lifting student agency. A lot of people say student voice. That's cool. I like student agency because it puts the focus, the power back in the hands of children, of youth. And then it's our job to bring that agency out and to support them in their efforts. And then we have to focus on designing solutions collaboratively, which are more likely to lead to positive outcomes. In a nutshell, if you do things for people and not collaboratively, jointly together, then it's going to fail every time. But there is power when you can design innovative solutions together.
Okay, let's talk about what that looks like. I know you've identified three specific things that teachers can do to enhance socio emotional learning. So let's talk about what that is, what that looks like in the classroom and in the virtual classroom.
For me, one way of doing this is through restorative conversations. And what a restorative conversation is, first, it's a great way to engage an entire classroom, entire community in building relationships, prioritizing dialogue, understanding, and cooperation. When done right, these restorative conversations can also help to create a culture that's established on trust, compassion, equity, inclusivity, and accountability. A big part of these restorative conversations is the use of what's called restorative questions. Now, you can ask questions such as, what happened? What's been going on for you? What were you feeling? What led up to the problem? That can help you to gain a greater understanding of what's happening with your students and even for yourself as the adult in that space. And what that does, it moves the element of power and it creates balance so that everyone is sharing. Everyone has a voice and they're contributing to that classroom environment. It's also important to reflect on how each person's behavior impacted the situations or anything that might have happened during that conversation. What that means is you're bringing a sense of equity to the conversation where everyone gets to share and contribute. One of my favorite restorative questions is, how can we repair the harm that has been done? And also, how might we prevent this from happening again? That is a powerful, powerful strategy that teachers can use, administrators, and even students can use to build understanding, develop empathy, and create a culture that's focused on building relationships.
I definitely want to affirm what you just said. And I also want to encourage any teachers who are listening and thinking, I don't know if my kids can do that. Yes, they can. They absolutely can. Those are questions that I have asked with my pre K students, with my third grade students. I've done it in instructional coaching with middle and high school students. Kids are really, really good. They have an innate sense of justice and an
Mm-hmm.
innate sense of what is fair and what's not fair. And if you bring this question to them, this situation has arisen and this was not right. How can we repair the harm? I think they will blow you away, especially with practice. They will blow you away
Yeah.
with the responses they come up with. And to me, my kids have always come up with better ideas than what I would have ever thought of myself.
Mhm. Absolutely. And that's exactly what I'm getting at is when you bring students to the table, when you bring that community to the table, what's happening is you're getting solutions and ideas from a different perspective that otherwise you never would have thought of. And that can really change that culture, that climate, and bring people together for good. So you're absolutely spot on with that.
Okay, so that's a little bit about these culturally affirming and restorative practices. We're going to get more into that later. Let's talk more about these other two things that teachers can do to enhance socio-emotional learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So another strategy, which is great, is called daily check-ins. And during these daily check-ins, it's perfect if you bring these restorative questions and restorative conversations to these daily check-ins. So what's a daily check-in? It's a easy, really convenient way to where you are literally checking in with the status, with the well-being, what's going on with your students inside of your classroom. Important part of this is helping students to identify and name their emotions because that's a very important skill for student success. Teachers can check in with each student or the class as a whole to understand how they're feeling in school that day. You can use a number system, 1 through 5, that's like a rating system, or for younger students, even some of the older students, a cloud system, sunny, cloudy, or rainy. This is a fail proof way to get students involved and to simply check in. And what you can do after you have that type of check in, you can begin getting a gauge. Okay, this student might need this today, or that student might need this today. And then you're constantly meeting their needs, making sure that they're showing up. And that also is a great way to build trust with your students because, like, hey, my teacher cares about me. They want to know how I'm doing every single day. And so I'm a huge proponent of checking in daily with your students. And then for staff as well, staff should be checking in, maybe not daily, but one of the things I was able to do at my school is to have weekly check ins where we checked in on Mondays. We had staff circles. And then on Fridays, we had checkout where staff came in. And it was a great way to close out the week as well. So, again, daily check ins are great for students as well as staff.
What do you recommend that teachers do if a student shares that they are in a low mood or they're having a bad day? How would that change a teacher's practice with that student that day?
One thing that I think is important is that teachers collaborate with social workers, school psychologists, school counselors as a way to get started so that they can, again, help meet the needs of their students. If this conversation is centered on meeting the social emotional needs of your students, then you must be collaborative in your approach. And if a student has significant concerns that are worrying to you, making sure that as part of your daily practice, you know how to refer students to the support that they need to get those unmet needs actually met. Now, if it's just, I'm not feeling it today, I'm not cool, then as a teacher, you can take that advice and say, you know what? Instead of answering all 4 questions, how about you just focus on one? Or what is it that you need? And that way you're able to have a conversation. This can happen in person or virtually. It can be, you might have a student who on this cloud system says, I'm feeling a little rainy. Well, you can send that student a private message saying, hey, I noticed that you said you're feeling a little rainy. What is it that you need today? Right? Going back to those restorative questions. What is it that you need? How might I be able to help you? And then the student can tell you what it is that they need. And then, most importantly, you actually must work towards meeting that need of that particular student. That is a fantastic way to listen to the needs of your students, to make sure that they have voice, and then you're building trust because you're following up on that action to make sure that they feel great. Another important thing, and I'll quickly say this, is that once you have been doing this for a while, you will see that these circles, that these practices take on power of their own. What I mean by that, it will be remarkable and it will blow you away to see that students will start lifting up other students. One important thing to remember here is that if you have a student who might say, hey, I'm feeling a little bit rainy, you might have a student who's feeling a little bit sunny. And then you might want to pair those students together on an activity so that they can balance each other out and they might be able to support one another. Again, It's building a community that's built on empathy and understanding and meeting the needs of one another. And it doesn't just have to be teacher to student, it can be student to student as well.
Oh, that's such a great suggestion and so easy to do. I love also that it gives the student the power to, or the agency, as you're saying, to reflect on and articulate what their needs are. And I think that sort of self awareness is so important for kids because it's frustrating when you're in a bad mood, but you don't know why and you don't know what's going to get you out of it. So taking that moment to think about, okay, what do I need? What would make this better? And having that self awareness of your own. Um, your own emotional well-being, I think is super, super powerful. And then, letting kids in on that process. We all have bad days, we all have low moods. And, talking about what we need from the people around us is just such a powerful life skill, to be able to communicate like that, with their partners in relationships, with their friends, with their family members, to be able to say, I'm not feeling great. Here's what I need from you I mean, that could be a life changer.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that that's a skill that needs to be developed. It's like a muscle. It takes practice. You have to work at it. You got to, lift those weights to make sure that muscle grows. Same thing. Students aren't magically going to wake up, even adults too, with the language that they need. In another training I do, I dive deeper into another practical strategy, which is helping students and staff to develop the social emotional vocabulary, which means learning to identify your feelings, learning to identify your emotions, learning to recognize the symptoms within your body. Are your hands becoming sweaty? Is your heart beating fast? And what does this mean? Are you overly excited? And once you can do those things, again, it takes practice, but it will lead to you being much better able to develop those core competencies of SEL. But it takes
Mhm.
practice.
Yes, it does. And I think it's a lifelong practice. It's something I'm still learning to do as an adult. And, as an aside, this is a little bit of a tangent here, but it's been something I've been wanting to kind of get off my chest anyway. So I'm
Right.
going to say it. I'm going to say it here. And that is, I sometimes hear teachers say things like, well, we can't cater too much to how students feel because when they get out in the workplace, their boss isn't going to care. So if you're having a bad day, your boss isn't going to let you off the hook. And I have a couple different thoughts about that. One is that I think once kids learn to identify these feelings and know how to shift themselves into a better space to understand what they need, that even if they're in a situation where they don't have that space, they are able to self-regulate a little bit better. But also, I think it's a big misunderstanding of workplace culture to assume that all bosses are deeply uncaring because
Right.
worked in a lot of workplaces. I mean, I just think about even some of the side jobs I had in high school and college, some teaching environments, some consulting work I've done in the last couple of years. And it is quite normal in many, many workplaces for a boss to say, if you're not feeling great today, then do that particular task tomorrow. It's an
Mhm.
important task, and I want you to be in a good headspace for it. Like I think sometimes some school environments are so toxic that teachers just assume that every workplace is toxic.
Mhm.
But this is not like we're not sending our kids off to work necessarily in like a factory in the industrial revolution times. Like
Right.
there is some space, and I think increasingly so. We're recognizing that even people who are in minimum wage jobs, we have to recognize their humanity. They are not
Mhm.
machines, they are not robots. We cannot push them 24/7. They will have different physical and emotional needs that interfere with them producing 24/7. And if you want to keep your workers, you have to treat them like humans. And so I
Absolutely.
don't worry too much about like we're not preparing kids for the real world if we're doing these kinds of things with them. No, that is the real world. And more importantly, this is the world we want to create. Some of
Mhm.
these students are going to go up and be the boss. They're
Yep,
going to be that CEO.
that's
They're
right.
going to have people under them. And I want them to treat their employees like humans.
That's right. You're absolutely right. And research has shown that students who can demonstrate these SEL skills have much better outcomes once they actually get to college and career, that they're able to keep a job longer and they're able to make more money because they have these skills. They can demonstrate empathy. They have an understanding of self awareness and social awareness. They can make responsible decisions. They can manage their time effectively. They know how to get up on time and make sure that they're doing their tasks to complete a job. So these skills are important for actually getting, keeping, and maintaining actual jobs. So you're absolutely right, Angela.
Awesome. I knew you would affirm that.
Yes,
I'm
absolutely.
glad I had that tangent with you.
Absolutely. Listen, I can talk about this all day long, so I'm happy to have this conversation with you.
Okay, so practical strategies. We talked about culturally affirming and restorative practices. We talked about those daily check ins. What's the third thing that teachers can do to enhance socio emotional learning?
Right. So the third strategy that I have, and there's been a number of schools and districts moving towards this, but it's the idea of having a morning meeting. And it's similar to a check in, but this is creating space, which is super important because if we're authentic and if we're sincere about it, we're going to build into the schedule space and time for students to address their social emotional needs. Now, you can do this by creating space in the form of a morning meeting. Some people have town halls, but the key concept here is to check in frequently, i.e., daily check ins. You can even celebrate what's working and then have restorative conversations about things that you might need to address to improve that school, that classroom culture, or climate. This can happen in person or virtually as well. The key thing here is to make sure that you're empowering all of your students with more than just having a voice. You're, again, Angela, this is my thing, you're empowering them with agency to where they can
Mhm.
feel comfortable and confident in doing these things on their own. You can do this by giving them a vote to give them ownership of their classroom environment. Now, that might be more so geared towards some of the older students, but even for the younger students, you can do things like giving them jobs, giving them responsibilities so that they feel that this is mine and I care about that. And what that does, it gives them pride and ownership over that experience. And then, Angela, I had one more bonus strategy that I
All
wanted
right.
to share with you and your listeners. Because I get this question, I get asked this question so much about people wanting actual strategies. And so often it's just these pie in the sky concepts. So I wanted to make
Mhm.
sure that you and your listeners were aware. I created what's called it's these SEL conversation cards. That's called What's Poppin'. Look, where I'm from, What's Poppin' is a greeting. It's a way to check in and see how someone's doing. So I created 50 of these conversation cards that teachers can use, like today, virtually or in person, to simply help get the conversation started. They're fun and simple ways to build community and quickly enhance that social emotional learning inside the classroom. And they're only $5 in their digital downloads. But they're fun ways to start conversations. There's one cool part. I call them action cards. And if you pull an action card, you have to complete some sort of action. For example, one of them is writing a gratitude note to a friend or sending a message to someone just to check in on them. But it's a great way to build community and bring SEL at the center of what you're doing inside of the classroom.
If teachers want to check that out, where should they go to get it?
Yep, so they can visit my website at www.lessonsforsel.com, and it's available on the website.
Okay, wonderful. I've looked at that. I've seen you also have SEL lessons. There's some great stuff there. So I hope teachers will check that out and support you in that.
Yes, thank you.
Um, Okay, so let's circle back around to this piece about being culturally affirming, because I want to talk more about how racial equity fits into socio emotional learning.
Mhm.
I have made the case on this podcast a number of times that these are not separate issues, that we can't tend to students' socio emotional well being without recognizing their full identities. And that includes their race, their ethnicity, their home culture. We need to see students for all that they are. And I think we can't truly do SEL with kids if we're not also examining and dismantling oppressive practices in our schools. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, Angela. And when we talk about buzzwords, my fear is that things like social justice and racial equity and dismantling oppressive systems are becoming buzzwords. But there's this part of me that remains optimistic that there's people out there who are sincere and relentless and actually working towards achieving this as an actual goal. It's absolutely imperative that we dismantle, and my word is disrupting these practices that for so long have disproportionately impacted and caused harm to groups of people. In fact, one of my things here lately has been making sure that people are aware and understand that social emotional learning in its true form was a way to address racial inequities. People might be saying, well, Doc, people call me Doc or, Byron. What do you mean by that? Well, if you knew the true origins of SEL, then you would know that SEL evolved out of the need to address racial inequities during the 1960s. Some might even argue that that time era was one of the most racially unjust times in American history. Of course, we have slavery and Jim Crow, but the 1960s was just a time that reeked of racial and civil unrest. So I want to shout out Dr. James Comer, who was the first African American. He was a full professor at Yale School of Medicine, but his pivotal work and research centered and eventually emerged into SEL. His work really focused on uplifting Black people up out of poverty through social and emotional development. That's powerful. He examined ways to improve outcomes for Black students in two high poverty New Haven elementary schools. He hypothesized that if you only focus on improving test scores, if you only focus on the academic growth of students, then this wouldn't even result in, any outcomes. You wouldn't improve your school. It wouldn't increase academic achievement. In fact, you would be doing more harm and getting much of the same results. So Dr. Comer, he focused on this concept, check this out, of the whole child. Where have we heard that before, right? In this new emerging term. He was talking about the whole child back in the 60s. And his approach centered on addressing, again, the unmet mental health needs of students. And he said, by doing that, by addressing those needs that have for so long gone unmet, then and only then will we see improvements in academic achievement. So even circling back to how we started this conversation, if we're not addressing the whole child, if we're not looking at the social emotional development, if we're not looking at this historical context, we're going to get it wrong every single time. And lastly, with Dr. Comer, I just want to say he believed that if we actually address these developmental issues of poor Black youth, as well as acknowledging those detrimental effects of racism and bigotry that has systemically been inflicted upon Black people, then only then would this lead to a systematic way of improving outcomes for Black youth. And that should be the focus of what he termed back then whole child or the social emotional development. So what that means now in our work, more than a buzzword, more than anything else, that our work, if it's true SEL, then we must find systemic ways to focus on improving outcomes for Black youth that is culturally affirming, that's strengthening, that's strength-based, right? We're no longer focusing on the deficits or the illnesses or what's wrong or, all of these negative things, but we're focusing, how can we focus on the brilliance of our Black students, of our brown students? How can we focus on their assets that can help them to improve outcomes, to improve academic achievement, to decrease conduct problems, to decrease emotional distress? Then and only then will we actually begin to move the needle in the right direction.
Thank you for teaching me that about Dr. Comer. I'm going to have to look that up and learn more about it because I'm really curious about it and I didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And it moved me to during the summer when the pandemic hit and everyone was posting the black square images on their social media. And I even heard some people saying, SEL, is not an effective way. I was like, people are being performative. And then you have another group of people who just don't understand the real racial undertones of SEL in the sense of this is a way to address the racial injustices. And so I actually wrote a blog post, which is on my website at www.lessonsforsel.com, titled, Did You Know That SEL Emerged from the Work of This Black Man? And my purpose was to educate people on where SEL came from. Why? So that now in the work that we're doing in schools and districts all over the country, that we can actually say, hey, if we go back to our roots, then we can focus on that social emotional development. Then we can really bring this racial justice to the front as a means to eradicate these oppressive systems that have been hurting our kids for so long.
Can you speak to folks who are thinking, I'm comfortable with doing SEL with my students. My administration supports me in that. But something like racial equity or examining oppressive practices, racial justice, I'm not sure that I'm ready to tackle that in an appropriate way with students. And I don't know if it's something I'm allowed to do because I think we would get pushback from parents. So, what can I do to address my kids' socio-emotional needs in that situation where having these really honest conversations, like what they're hearing right now, don't feel possible?
Right, right. Yeah, so people must resist the need to take equity detours. And equity detours have been described as detours that white people follow to protect their privilege and avoid the actual work, the real work of racial justice. And these detours might look different, but basically they create an illusion of progress towards equity. Um, but the problem here is that it can even exacerbate inequities. And the reality is, they can be even more devastating than explicit racism. Why? Because they do racism's work while consuming resources that should be geared towards combating and disrupting these oppressive systems. Angela, simply put, they mask racial inequity. These detours relieve people of the responsibility to name and eliminate the ways that racism operates, especially inside of schools and with our children. So, for some people, instead of being on an authentic path to equity, they're on a detour around it. And for even more people, they're just admiring it. And as this new term has emerged, people are on this performative allyship to where they like it, they want to admire it, but they're not committed to doing the real work of disrupting it. So I actually, again, on my website, developed a completely free resource to provide families, parents, educators with SEL and racial equity resources so that they can start and not take detours, but be on a path to actually dismantling these oppressive systems and actually do the work.
I think another equity detour sometimes from teachers is thinking, well, I teach in a school that's all white or mostly white. So therefore, this isn't really something that applies to me.
Yeah, and sadly, I get that a lot. Or I'm a black educator and I work in an all black school as well. The reality is that if you're in an all black school, if you're in an all white school, we all must be doing this work. Because even if you're in an all white school, a white educator with white students, it's still your job to be an ally, to help those students to understand ways that their privilege is showing up or ways that they might be able to dismantle systems for other people around them. You also might want to examine, why is this a space where no black people are? Right?
Mm.
Like, in and of itself. And same thing in black communities, like, you have to be able to take a step back and examine, why is this neighborhood school that is in this high poverty stricken area all black, but across town it's an all white school? You must be able to step back wherever you are and look at that this has been systematically designed to discriminate and separate people, which without a doubt leads to more unjust and inequities. And look, so we look, you started by asking what gets me fired up. This
Let's
conversation
do it.
right here gets me fired up because I work in a high poverty area in an all black school, and so many times people blame the kids in that school for being in the condition that it's in, and that's not true. We have to look at the entire system that has led to that school being in the condition that it's currently in the first place. And this has been through years of policies, of Jim Crow, of racial segregation and discrimination, and housing policies, and redlining, which has led to these very conditions that we're in, which means that these kids are forced to go to these schools where they lack resources, where they don't have curriculums, where they don't have access to textbooks, where there's police that's over policed inside of these schools, which leads to the criminalization of these kids. So, getting back on track and answer your question, what that means is, whether you're in that all black school or that white school across town, you must be able to educate all of those kids so that they can understand how these systems have been created and are leading to systems that continue to perpetuate harm being done to these kids.
That's right. Well said. I want to shift topics a little bit before we close out and talk about socio-emotional wellness amongst staff members, because I know you've done a lot of work in that area too. And I think so often we hear teachers being told to practice self-care and to center the socio-emotional needs of their students, but at the same time, the culture of the school is the opposite of that.
Mhm.
There's no real change on the institutional level to make teacher self-care possible or to center the socio-emotional needs of teachers. So I know you were really clear from the very beginning, you're in this for the kids. And so I want to talk about what's your take on this and what should schools be doing to take care of teachers' mental and emotional health? How does that fit in with your mission about centering the needs of children?
Right. We're in it for the kids, but we can't be in it for the kids if we're not taking care of ourselves. Beyond, again, we have to move beyond this performative way. Like, we have to move towards action. I'm all about being action oriented. And I think it's important for district leaders, for building leaders, that they have to listen to the needs of teachers, one, and then take action to meet their needs in an authentic and caring way. If you want teachers to practice self care, give them more planning time and less burdensome responsibilities. If you want teachers to practice self care, give them the gift of time instead of adding more and more on their plate. If you want teachers to practice self care, then show your appreciation and gratitude for them by acknowledging all of their hard work in the form of shout outs, gift cards, incentives, and again, paid time off. If you can't commit to those things, then administrators and districts, honestly, they should keep their disingenuous rhetoric to themselves. If you're not about the action, we're not here for it. So that's what I think needs to happen if we're serious about self care.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's super important. It is disingenuous is a powerful word here because, it's really hard to ask teachers to check in on their students and to follow up with them and differentiate for their needs when no one's doing that for teachers. It's not being modeled in the system. It's a pretty cold, heartless system for a lot of teachers,
Mm-hmm.
but they're expected to be super empathetic, towards students. And if you've never had anyone treat you that way, it's really hard to know how to give that to your students.
Right. And my fear is that we are going to have teachers come summer 2021 leaving the field in droves. We're going to have teachers who are going to retire. It's going to be a mass exodus from the field. Why? Because they're not having their needs met. And when teachers' needs are met, there is no way possible that they are going to be able to adequately address the unmet needs of children. So it must be a priority. It must move beyond just being words, and it must move into action. And one of the things that I've been lucky to do in my school is to have conversations with staff and educators about what it is that you need, and then being able to advocate at the school leader level as well as the district level as well about these are their needs. This is what they need to actually be able to do their job. This is what they need to be able to get out of their car in the morning instead of just sitting in the parking lot dreading coming into that building. And if we're not serious about it, then we're going to have a ton of staff leaving out. I've been fortunate to be at a school to where our admin is serious about prioritizing the need. I've been having conversations with my school leadership and the district level about prioritizing a really big initiative that we have coming up in the spring. I don't want to give too much away, but it's going to be something that's transformative. And if you don't have school level leaders and district leaders who are in the business of implementing something transformative for your staff, then hey, we got a lot more work that we need to do to make this a reality for our teachers. They deserve it.
I want to close out with a takeaway truth, something for teachers to think about in the week ahead. What is something that you wish every teacher understood about socio emotional learning?
I'll keep this one short. Look, I've been so fired up. I know I've been going for a while. But for me, equity, justice, and culturally affirming practices must be at the core of everything SEL, and that genuine, authentic social-emotional learning must be accredited from the work of a Black man, Dr. James Comer.
Thank you so much for this, Byron. Thanks for bringing our attention to the history of this, too. That is so powerful for us to understand.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. This gets me fired up. I'm excited to get back out there and keep this work going. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you for getting us fired up, too.